Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Hope you are well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And my apologies for the late start, but it is what it is. Okay, let's see what we have with us. Assalamu alaikum, Ali. Hope you are. Good to see you. Hi, man. Wa alaikum assalam. Always a pleasure. And Nico says, please read my comment on your previous video about the nafs, the state of the pre-flood man, etc. All right, I will do that after this, hopefully. Okay, let me get this presentation underway. Give me a second. Sort of change things around here. All right, so I can do it this way. Okay. There we are. All right, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about was a suggestion by one of our guests from last time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of the divine names spiritually, right? So in terms of spiritual practice, for the use of the divine names, because it is something which is used in numerous religious traditions, not just Islam and the Sufi tradition within Islam, but it also exists in other traditions. The use of names of the divine, meditating on them, understanding them, invoking them, and having practices centered around them in order to sort of like spiritually progress. Okay, to come closer to God. Okay, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. Now, a lot of the stuff you can actually just find online anyway, in terms of if you read upon on the Tasawwuf, the Sufism tradition in Islam, you can find a lot about that anyway, right? What I want to do is just highlight a few things from the Qur'an, and just my own just little points I thought it would be good to mention. It isn't a complete presentation. I would have liked to have maybe added a few more things, but I think I will get through the important points as I see them, right? From my own thinking in terms of these issues from a more Quranic sort of standpoint, or giving it more roots from a Quranic standpoint. Okay, so let's talk about this. So this is an interesting little thing. What I was doing before, I was thinking to myself, okay, I need to find something to put for a thumbnail, and I just put this idea of ascent or ascension by the divine names. I put that into a search engine. I use DuckDuckGo one, and of course all of these search engines now, they have an AI answer as the first thing, and this came up, which is a pretty good little summation, right? So it says here, the concept of ascension in relation to the divine names refers to the idea that through understanding and invoking these names, one can achieve a higher spiritual state or connection with the divine, right? This reflects a belief in the transformative power of sacred names in spiritual practices, right? And that's a pretty good summary of what we're talking about here. But let's just look at this in terms of from a trying to ground it in a Quranic sort of like idea. The first thing you note when you talk about names, right, in the Quran, I mean, it's one of the first stories that comes up is, of course, Adam and the names, right? Adam and the names. So there's an Adamic link to names, right? That God taught Adam the names, right? He didn't teach the angels the names. What are these names? And there's a lot of debate about what the names were. Okay, those who would take sort of like a more I don't know, cross-religious text reading might conclude that the names. I mean, I saw something a while back, I think, on Twitter, where somebody was showing that the names is likely to refer to the names of prophets or messengers or the righteous, right, from Adam's offspring, right? And I suppose that can make sense. I don't see as much how it will make sense in the context of the story that's been given to us in the Quran with respect to Adam, right? Why is Adam being taught the names? Because it's something that's been juxtaposed almost with the angels, right? That God is teaching Adam the names, but He isn't teaching the angels the names, right? The angels say, "Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana." Glory to you, we have no knowledge except what you taught us. But even that, it's a very the story itself needs a lot of thought, right? Because it's a very strange situation, right? The angels are saying, "Glory to you, we have nothing except what you taught us," right? Well, that goes for Adam too, right? It goes for Adam too. It's a very, it's like having two students, right? Who you say, "I'm going to ask you a question," and one of your students, you tell them the answer, give them the answers. Then afterwards, you ask both students, the question, who's going to know the answer? Well, of course, the one you taught, and the one you didn't teach isn't going to know. Okay, so what exactly is being proven here in terms of in the story, right? Because God could have taught the angels names, right? But it seems to be it's something more about the Adamic creature. He was created in a way where it's more suitable for him to be taught the names, right? That perhaps God couldn't actually teach the angels the names, right? That it's not in their nature to know the names, whatever these names were, right? Which is why it doesn't as much make sense to say that these names were, the descendants of Adam or, just people, the names of people, right? Which people, looking in the verses, people say, those who make the tafsir, so to speak, that the names are the names of people. They rely quite a bit on ha'ula, right? The word used is, نبئوني بأسماء هؤلاء. Tell me of the names of these. Okay, what are these people? The ha'ula is typically used for people. In any case, what I want to highlight here is that there is something unique with respect to the human creature and his relationship with names. Okay, something that the angels themselves did not possess and or were not given. Okay, so what were these names? That God taught Adam, but not the angels. So that they were the divine names is actually a very acceptable, I think, understanding, especially since it seems the teaching of the names to Adam is a rebuttal against the angels, saying that they glorify God, they glorify His praises, right? So they said, are you going to create in it the one who will spill blood and cause much bloodshed? While what do we do? نحن نسبح بحمدك ونقدس لك. While we make tasbih of your hamd, of your praises, and we glorify you. Okay, so it would seem that and then when God says, "Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun," I know what you don't know, right? And then again, here we have what's being mentioned. I know, ilm, right? I have knowledge of that which you do not know, and then that knowledge He imparts it onto Adam. Right? He gives it to Adam. Okay, why didn't He give it to the angels? What the point is, He gave it to Adam, right? And so now, whatever that knowledge is, it should be something on par with or superior to the angels glorifying the praise of Allah and holifying Him, right? Declaring His holiness. نقدس لك, right? And this could be in relation to that sort of like more deeper understanding of God through His names. So the angels are making tasbih, right? They're glorifying Him, right? But it's almost like a bland thing, you could say, right? The angels have just sort of like this bland tasbih of Allah, this bland holification of Him. You're holy, you're praised, right? They're doing this tasbih of His hamd, His praises, and taqdees, but they don't have the immense plurality of the divine names, right? They're not showcasing in their praise for Him like all of the richness of the divine names. They're not going to be able to praise God, so to speak, in terms of seeing Him as someone who's forgiven them for sins, for example, right? They don't have that relationship with Allah, right? So these sort of things, right? So I'm just saying that it makes more sense, I think, when you just read it Quranically, that the names we mentioned here are God's names, right? God's names. And that's what you have throughout the Quran. When God talks about names, so it's about God's names, right? And some of it is, you can also juxtapose it with the issue of the idols, right? The false deities. What does God call them, right? In the Quran, He says these are but names that you have named, right? So there's also as much as humanity has the ability to sort of like give expression to the divine names, He has the ability to do the opposite and give names to false things, to just, to idols. These are but names that you have named, you and your forefathers. God has not sent down with it any sultan, right? So you have this recurring sort of like theme in the human being, right? That he has this relationship with names and naming, right? And of course, we see that even in humanity. I mean, from all the creatures that we know, of course, we're only really intelligent beings that we know. But the amount of the way you categorize and name things, right? We're always giving things names. Okay, so that's just something to note. Okay, so let's look at what are we talking about here when we're talking about the divine names, right? In the Quran, Allah calls them Lillahi al-asma al-husna, right? So to Allah belongs all of the beautiful names. Fad'uhu biha, so call Him with them and know Him by those names, right? So don't just give names to false idols, non-existent things. These are but names that you have named, you and your forefathers. But to God, you should attribute all of the beautiful names, the best names. And there's this section here in Surah Al-Hashr where a number are given in succession, right? So you sort of understand what we're talking about here. So it's this famous section here. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم. He is Allah, other than whom there is no other deity, know of the unseen and the witnessed. He is the entirely merciful, especially merciful. That's what they have here, right? Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Ar-Rahman actually means Almighty, right? Ar-Rahman is not really one of the names of mercy, right? If you go through the Quran, you see that it's more akin to the Almighty, right? So the Quran talks about, punishment coming from Ar-Rahman, right? And these sort of things. It's actually, remember that the Arabs didn't know what it meant. We now later sort of like more disconnected, you would say, from Arabic. We who are later learning Arabic, through roots and stuff like that, we would automatically look at that and just think, oh, Ar-Rahman means the merciful, right? But that's another issue when it comes to the idea of roots, right? Trying to interpret everything through roots, right? The Arabs, when they saw this, Ar-Rahman, they didn't interpret it through roots. They were completely confused by Ar-Rahman. They didn't know what that meant, right? And the reason why they didn't know what that meant is because they're not reading things in that sort of way, the way that we might want to, right? Rahman was an alien concept to them, right? And it's actually because it was used by Christians in South Arabia, right? It wasn't really in vogue, sort of like in the Hijaz. But anyway, Rahman, the Almighty, really, okay? And then again, next verse, Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illahu, He is Allah, other than whom there is no deity. And then we have a series of names. Al-Malikul Quddus Al-Salam Al-Mu'min Al-Muhaymin Al-Aziz Al-Jabbar Al-Mutakabbir, right? These are all names, in definite article. So, the sovereign, the pure, it says here, Al-Quddus, more like the holy rather than the pure. But anyway, says here the perfection, as-salam. I don't know why, it's the peace, right? As-salam, or the bestower of peace, the one who gives peace, or just peace, right? As-salam. The bestower of faith, al-mu'minu, right? So you could say the faithful one, the one who will, the owner of faith, sort of. Al-muhayminu, the overseer, I suppose is good enough. Al-aziz, the exalted in might, right? The one who has izzah. Al-jabbar, the compeller. Al-mutakabbir, right? The superior, but here it literally means arrogant. You could say that. Of course, we don't typically view the word arrogant in a positive light, but the Quran talks about الذين يتكبرون في الأرض بغير حق, those who are arrogant on the earth without any right. Okay, God's sort of arrogance isn't an arrogance without right, because it isn't that kind of. When we talk about arrogance in English, we really mean somebody who's putting themselves above their station, right? Subhanallah amma yushrikun, glory to God above that which they do in shirk, right? Which lets you know that there can be a relationship when it comes to the shirk. There can be a relationship with these things, right? That when it talks about a type of shirk in the names, let's say, right? Which is where I think Ibn Taymiyyah and these people got the idea of, tawheed of the names, right? هو الخالق, and he is the khaliq, the bari, the musawwir, right? The creator, the sort of like the inventor, originator, the musawwir, the fashioner, the giver of forms. To him belong all of the beautiful names. يسبح له, and they do tasbih to him, all that are in the heavens and the earth, and he is the Aziz and the Hakim. So you have Aziz coming twice, right, in this here. Now, why these names in particular mentioned, that's another topic for, why these names and why in these sequence, right? What is unique about these names? But one thing I do note about some of these names is they have more of a relationship to us, the human being, right? So when it comes to, again, going back to thinking about the angels aren't going to be able to relate to some of these names as much as a human being will, right? Not going to be able to relate to them as much as we do on this earth. But that's example of what we're talking about when talking about the names, right? In terms of practice, we in the Quran mentions again and again the calling, the invoking of Allah with the names. So here we have قُلِ ادْعُوا اللَّهَ وَادْعُوا الرَّحْمَنَ أَيًّا مَا تَدْعُوا فَلَهُ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. Right? Call upon Allah or call upon Ar-Rahman. Whichever you call upon, to him belongs the best or the most beautiful names, right? And this is in relation again to the Arabs not knowing what Ar-Rahman was, right? So people take this as a very exalting the name of Ar-Rahman as almost equal to Allah, right? قُلْ أَتُوا اللَّهُ وَادْعُوا الرَّحْمَنَ. But if you understand the context, it's sort of just if the Arabs had been confused about one of the other names of Allah, instead maybe you would have that one here. But it's just talking about here whichever name you use to invoke him with, to him belongs the most beautiful names. And in that same verse we have وَلَا تَجْهَرْ بِصَلَاتِكَ وَلَا تُخَافِتْ بِهَا وَابْتَغِ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ سَبِيلًا. And do not publicize your salah. All right, it's not about, again, this isn't about that your salah should be loud or silent. There's a debate some Quranists have about this, that why are some of your salah, the Sunnah salah, why some of it's said out loud and some of it's said silently, when the Quran says don't be silent or loud in your salah, but choose a middle way. It isn't about that, right? It's about publicizing your salah. Do not publicize your salah, nor should you try to sort of like hide it from people, right? Like don't do your salah always secretly, hiding it, right? As if it's something to be ashamed of. Nor be out there all the time doing it publicly, publicizing it, right? But have a way in between that, right? So that's what it's about. It's not about quietly and loudly, and that's irrelevant, right? But the point is that it's put here in relation to the names, right? Invoking the names on Salah, there's a relationship here. Okay, so here mentioned alongside Salah, and thus the invoking or calling upon Him by the names can be a form of dhikr and have the purpose of dhikr, right? Just like Salah has the purpose of dhikr, invoking Him by the names can be just for dhikr as well. Okay, the effect of the names. I mean, can the names help you in terms of just invoking the names? Help you into, is there a link between them and salvation, right? And taking you back towards your humanity? I think there is, because if you look at this verse, one of the famous verses about those who end up in hell are those who are like cattle, right? So it says, وَلَقَدْ ذَرَأْنَا لِجَهَنَّمَ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ, and we have certainly created for hell many among the jinn and mankind. Okay, what about them? They have hearts of which they do not understand, and they have eyes of which they do not see, and they have ears of which they do not hear, right? لهم قلوب لا يفقهون بها ولهم أعين لا يبصرون بها ولهم آذان لا يسمعون بها أولئك كالأنعام. They are like cattle. بل أضل, right? They are like cattle. بل هم أضل. Rather, they are more astray. أولئك هم الغافلون. Those are the ones who are heedless. They are in ghafla. Ghafla is the opposite of dhikr, the opposite of, having remembrance. Okay, so then very next verse after this is a verse about God's names, right? The beautiful names. So it says this, and then it says وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى, and to Allah belongs the best of names. So invoke Him by them. Okay, so that is almost given to you as a cure for this, right? So as not to end up like these, right? One cure, one way out, one protection to not become like this is to invoke Allah by His beautiful names. وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. So call Him, by them. Okay, وَذَرُوا الَّذِينَ يُلْحِدُونَ فِي أَسْمَائِهِ, and leave the company of those who practice, I don't know, his deviation concerning His names. يُلْحِدُونَ is sort of like, it means to sway away, right, from His names, to like sort of like, set them aside, right? All right, sort of like here as in the ghafilun, those who are heedless, right? سيجزون ما كانوا يعملون, right? They will be rewarded for what they did, which is another of the many verses in the Qur'an which shows that rewards are for what you do, what you have been doing. So what does it mean? It means that calling, invoking Him by the divine names is a way to save yourself from that state mentioned in the previous verse. So a way to have hearts that will understand, okay, and to have eyes that will see, and to have ears that will hear, right? And to be more human and less cattle-like, one way for that is calling upon Allah or invoking upon Allah through His divine names, okay, which goes back again to being Adamic, right? To being of a human being, right? All right, so being like Adam, who has this link to the names, right? And one of the ways to understand that link, by the way, I wrote here in the end, was that when the verse says وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ, the word عَلَّمَ it can literally mean to imprint, right? To imprint upon something, right? عَلَّمَ, when you typically it's used to mean taught, when you teach somebody, and sort of when you teach somebody, you imprint, right? You're imprinting knowledge, you're imparting knowledge, right? But the other way to understand that is to imprint the actual names into the human being, right? So an example of that in Surah Ar-Rahman, where Allah says about the human being, خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ عَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانِ, that God created the human being and He taught him bayan, He taught him speech, right? That's how it's normally translated. But عَلَّمَ here can just mean He imprinted in him the ability for speech, and that's something which has been shown by many linguists, people like Noam Chomsky and those. They show that the human being is just imprinted, created for language, right? The human being is a creation which is basically can't but not form language, right? There's an imprintedness in a human being for language, right? That's why kids from a young age, they can just learn any language, put them anywhere in the world, from any culture. Take a baby from one race, one culture, from one part of the world, put him in a completely different one, another part of the world, and he will learn that language no problem, right? Because there's an imprint for the language in there already. So you can also think of it in the same way that the human being has this imprint for the divine names. When God taught Adam the names, right, that he imprinted the names into Adam, right? So in that way, you would get around this idea of that God taught Adam the names, but he didn't teach the angels. Instead, you'd say that God imprinted the names on Adam, right? And that's why he was able to formulate the names, right? He formulated the names afterwards. Anyway, that's another idea to look into, right? But anyway, all of this takes us into the idea of the practice, right? What is it, right? So I think most of you have seen it, of course, the idea of sitting and just repeating the divine name, right? Repeating it and invoking it and meditating upon it, right? Repeating the names, whether it's Allah, right? Allah, 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 or Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahman, sometimes with the Ya, so Ya Ar-Rahman, Ya Rahman, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, all that, right? So you have these practices that are used in terms of invoking the names and meditating upon them, going back to that very first slide. And with that, I want to just, I think it's apt to mention this hadith in relation to this link here, right? This link of how, you have those who, they have hearts which they cannot hear, the ears which they cannot hear, right? Sorry, eyes of which they cannot see, etc. You have this famous hadith, right, which is at sort of like at the the center of a lot of Sufi practices anyway. But the idea of how you come closer to Allah, right, is through extra devotion, right? So it's a famous hadith. It's hadith Qudsi, one of those where the Prophet is saying, Allah has said this, right? That whoever shows enmity to someone devoted to me, to a saint of mine, basically, a wali and li, I shall be at war with him. My servant does not draw near to me with anything more loved by me than the religious duties I have enjoined upon him. So the things that you should do. And then after that, my servant continues to draw near to me with extra works, right? Nawafil, right? Extra works like dhikr, right? Like extra salah, or invoking God's names, until I love him. And then when I love him, I am his hearing with which he hears, and his seeing with which he sees, right? And his hand with which he strikes, right? And that's the part that I wanted to highlight, right? And his foot with which he walks, and were he asks something of me, I would surely give it to him, etc., right? And I'm highlighting that because I think it can be related to this, right? You can see a root in this hadith from these two verses together, right? That you have these people who will be in hellfire. Why? Well, they have hearts which they cannot think. They have, eyes of which they cannot see. Ears of which they cannot hear. And the cure for that sort of is to invoke God's names, right? God's names, and to bring you out of that, right? And so you're able to actually see through God, hear through God, understand through God. Okay, so I think it's worth mentioning that. Okay, so in terms of the practices, where is it mentioned? So the Quran does mention quite often the idea of actually devotion to the name, right? To the name of your Lord, right? So the concept of remembering, invoking, glorifying the name of your Lord is one that appears pretty early among our first commands directly to the Prophet, right? Because in the beginning, remember, the Prophet needs to be strengthened, right? He had just become a messenger. He was, you can see from the Quran itself that he was shaken up by it. He was unsure by it. It was something that he was expecting. So he needed to be strengthened with it, right? And when it comes to the verses which talk about that, one of the earliest is Al-Muzammil, right? Or you who is wrapped up in a cloak. Because in the beginning, the Prophet used to wrap himself in a cloak, right? Whether out of fear or just for comfort, right? Something like this happens to you, you seek comfort, right? So, he was told, Ya ayyuhal muzammil qum al-layla illa qalila, stand up for prayer at night, except a little bit, right? And then you have those verses. If you go back and read the beginning of this surah up to verse 8, you will see that it is, enjoining upon him, these spiritual practices in order to become more grounded, right? Because he is about to have something very weighty put upon him. Okay, and one of the things which is mentioned is وَاذْكُرِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ وَتَبَتَّلْ إِلَيْهِ تَبْتِيلًا, and remember, do dhikr of the name of your Lord. So don't say وَاذْكُرْ رَبَّكَ, right? There are verses like this: remember your Lord, right? Just remember your Lord. It's وَاذْكُرْ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ, remember the name of your Lord specifically, right? وَاذْكُرِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ وَتَبَتَّلْ إِلَيْهِ تَبْتِيلًا, and devote yourself to him or to it, right? Because the name here, the dhamir, the pronoun, right? You can read it as it, right? So you can say and remember the name of your Lord and devote yourself to it with complete devotion, right? So I mean, it goes without saying that the Prophet is going to devote himself to Allah with complete devotion, but it makes more sense here in terms of instructions for strengthening him to say, no, devote yourself to the name of your Lord completely, right? And the devotion here, tabattul, is that kind of like, ritualistic worshipful devotion, right? So dhikr of the name isn't just about, of course, vocal repetition, though, right? Even though, of course, even that it shouldn't be diminished, right? Even somebody who is sitting there and has already decided to sit there and repeat one of the names of Allah for 10, 15, 20 minutes to meditate on it, even if in the end they're not sort of like present while doing it, their body is doing it. That is something still, right? Their tongue is doing it. That is still something, right? It's not doing it. Okay. But of course, the idea is, the real goal is to have it being repeated by your whole self. So tabattal ilayhi tabtila, devote yourself to it wholeheartedly, completely, right? So it's with your whole self. Okay. So it's to remember Allah, or to remember the name of Allah with your whole self, with your whole being, with your tongue, your mind, your heart, and ultimately, hopefully, by your soul or spirit as well, right? So that goes there. There are other verses, of course, which mention this, سَبِّحِ اسْمِ رَبِّكَ الْأَعْلَى, right? Exalt the name of your Lord, the Most High. So it's about the name again. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى وَذَكَرَ اسْمَ رَبِّهِ فَصَلَّى. Certainly successful the one who purifies himself. So, it seems that they need to have a bit of purity first for the names to have the most impact, right? The most impact. So it says here, successful as the one who purifies himself, first. وَذَكَرَ اسْمَ رَبِّهِ فَصَلَّى, and then he makes dhikr of the name of his Lord and does salah with it. Okay, does salah with it. Alright, as well, وَذْكُرِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ بُكْرَةً وَأَصِيلًا, right? And mention or do dhikr of the name of your Lord morning and evening, right? So we're talking about ritualistically, right? Remembering God, right? وَمِنَ اللَّيْلِ فَاسْجُدْ لَهُ وَسَبِّحُهُ لَيْلًا طَوِيلًا. In the night, prostrate to him and glorify him, for a long part of the night, right? And again, here we have this verse which appears quite a lot. فَسَبِّحْ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ الْعَظِيمِ, right? So make tasbih of your Lord, the Great. And that's why you have sort of in the traditional Salah, you have a lot of times where you say, Subhana Rabbil Azim, Subhana Rabbil Azim. It's mentioned, I think, in the ruku', right? Okay, so there's an idea in the spiritual practices, including in tasawwuf, which I'd like to sort of just expand here a bit, which is the idea that with the divine, true love of God arrives in the heart before true gnosis of God, true knowledge, true ma'rifah of God. So knowledge, love of Allah actually fills the heart before you actually come to know God, right? Now with creation, it's of course usually the reverse, right? You come to know somebody first, and then based on your knowledge of that person, right, you come to love them, okay? And now that sequence, of course, holds true even for the divine, for God as well, okay? But the love and knowledge achieved by that process isn't what this statement is referring to. The statement of sort of like the gurus and the people who actually sort of tread the path of spirituality and gain these insights through experience. Okay, they're not referring to that kind of love that you get, you know, sort of like through your own efforts of learning, and then through your learning starting to love, because that ultimately is going to be flawed, right? It's going to be flawed because it arises from our own perception of God, right? And our own perception of God will always be a little bit flawed, right? It will always be a little bit flawed, right? No matter what we try to do, how we try to perceive God while in this world through this world, there's going to be a little bit of flaw in that, right? It's not going to be that pure thing, right? So rather what is meant here is something that permeates sort of creation, right? That, you know, it's like what the Christians will say, you know, God is love. They have this, you know, this thing where, you know, I remember one person I met, you know, he was arguing with a mutual Christian friend where, you know, he's like, no, what do you mean God is love? Love is a actually, you can't say God is love. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. And, you know, it's too nitpicking, right? But the idea, you know, that God's love and knowledge and himself, it permeates creation, right? When Quran talks about Allah, he's the first, the last, the outer and the inner, right? Everything which is apparent, zahir, and everything which is hidden. So all around us. And so it's something all around. Let's just put it that way, you know, something all around, okay? But it will not come in us because of our veils, right? So we are the barriers to what is around us. We ourselves are the have veils and barriers to what is around us, right? So think of it as sort of an analogy here is like an object in a waterproof jacket or waterproof wrapper submerged in the ocean, right? And you know that object inside it thinks there's nothing around it, but in fact there's everything around it. It's just there's a barrier between it and the ocean, right? So each call, each invocation of the divine name, or you know, remembrance of Allah, is like a summon, a request for that surrounding water to sort of poke into that jacket, right? To poke holes into that barrier, and eventually getting through, right? And then what happens? The water gets through and soaks what's on the inside, you, right? Soaks the interior, and it soaks the interior even before that shell, that barrier starts to dissipate, and then allows you from the inside to be able to see, yes, that you are in the ocean, right? So you sort of get wet, right, before you actually see the ocean around you, right? And that's a sort of an analogy for this idea of how God's love enters you first before you even come to know God. We're talking about real, sort of like that different type of love, let's say, right? Not born from your perceptions, right? But something which springs from you internally, right? And then later after that, knowledge, true, what the Sufis will call ma'rifah of God, or the fath at the opening, can occur. Okay, so why is dhikr of the divine so powerful anyway? Okay, because the divine, in terms of the dhikr, God is active in it as well, and present. He's an active, present partner in your dhikr, right? We have this idea of what in the Quran here, it's not even an idea, the verse, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرُكُمْ, right? Remember me, I will remember you. When you do dhikr of Allah, Allah does dhikr of you. Right? When you mention Allah, Allah mentions you. Excuse me. When you recall Allah, Allah recalls you. Right? So there is this linking, right? That whenever you do any mention of Allah, when you sit down and you invoke Allah, when you sit and I'm talking about sitting, with one of the divine names and actually, putting your whole self into that. Okay, there's a reciprocal reaching out. That reaching out that you're doing towards the divine through that name, there's a reciprocal reaching down towards you, okay, and the link can be formed that way, okay. You can have that sort of link. So it's not the same as, for example, like you remembering anybody else, right? You can sit at home and remember somebody else. That person is not present with you. They don't know you're doing it. They're not there with you, right? They're not all around you, right? They're not closer to you than your jugular vein. but Allah is, right? Allah is present and active in your dhikr, right? But even just from us, like going back to that idea between us ourselves, the human creation, there is a link which is created between the one who's remembering and the remembered. Okay, and you see that in the idea, it's been studied a little bit. The idea of like telephone, what's called telephone telepathy, right? That, sometimes you think of calling somebody and then they call you, right? Or you call somebody and just when you call them, they're like, oh, I was just thinking about you, right? That sort of thing. That there is a spiritual link even between us, okay? Whether it's due to quantum entanglement or instantaneous outreach of our consciousness, right? That we end up our consciousness reach out from our minds or from our heart, across the distance to somebody in America or Canada or wherever, right? And touch their minds, and then they, having remembered them, there's a link forged where they end up remembering you. Okay, so you can have maybe that, or whether it's just our spirits become linked, right? Our spirits are linked between ourselves, sort of like whether it's the links that are forged, through knowing people and coming to know them, or even family bonds, right? So like what happens with NDEs and people who adopted children who have NDEs, and then they see in their NDEs their actual biological parents who they've never met, and then they later on recognize them from photos and things like this. Okay, point is, our remembrance of others can actually cause them to remember us. Okay, so it draws us together. Okay, it draws us together in some way. Okay, it brings us closer. It creates this link. So how much more must this be for God, who is fully aware of us and our remembrance, and is with us, right, when we are doing it, okay, and who says that if you remember him, he remembers you, okay, and it's almost given like, it's not almost like I don't want to say like a choice, it is a choice, but it's something which is almost like automatic. فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ, right? It's not like, remember you, and I will remember you, or maybe I will remember you. No, remember me, I will remember you. فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ, right? So what does that mean when you remember the merciful, you remember the almighty, you remember the subtle, remember the patient one, remember any of God's beautiful names, right? Does he remember you with something, an outreach of that, okay? That we come closer to those qualities, or that we become colored by them, or that we become influenced by them, right? Those beautiful names. And that's at the heart of some of the ideas of which names are used in dhikr practices, right? And I've mentioned this book before, so The Degrees of the Soul. If you haven't had a read of it, it's very short. Highly recommend it. But it talks something about this, the use of names and invoking them to go through the spiritual journey of arriving at ma'rifah, of gnosis of God, and rectifying the ego through repetition of some of the names of Allah, and of course through other the normal spiritual practices, fasting, praying at night, controlling your anger, right, not eating too much, hunger, vigilance, these sort of things. But a central part of it is using the names as well, right? And there are certain names which are being used by different spiritual paths, which they see as most important in different parts of your path, right? And then if you have a specific sheikh or guru, somebody who has some insight into what you would need at a certain point in your journey, they might recommend you to focus on a certain name in specifically, right? So if you are in a state where, I don't know, you've become very sort of like very much in the Jalali sense, sort of like colored by the majesty, the majestic qualities, right? So you become much more like firm, more hard against any injustices, less lenient and more like stringent, if you become more like this, they might encourage you to repeat some of the names of Allah, which are focus more on the leniency, right? Al-Halim, right? Repeat that name. If you are in a state where you've lost a lot of vigor, right? They might tell you to repeat the name Al-Hayy, the alive one, right? Ya Hayy, right? Or Ya Qayyum, right? Sort of like the idea being that by focusing on some of the names, you can have a rejuvenation of certain qualities. All right. And last thing I wanted to mention is, in English they don't exist, I don't think, but in Arabic there's a whole sway of poetry and invocations which are centered upon the names of Allah only. Right. One of my favorites is this one. If anybody knows Arabic to see it, Manzumat Asma Allah al-Husna by Sheikh Ahmed al-Dardir, which is basically just a poem, right, where basically every couplet is focused on one of the divine names and calling to Allah by one of them. So it goes through that list of 99 names of Allah and a few others, I think, and it goes through them. And each verse by itself can be a prayer, can be its own prayer that you can repeat, or you can say the whole poem. So I'd encourage you, if you have, if you're from one of the traditionally Islamic languages, right, which have a long history of Islam in them, you usually find poetry centered upon the divine names, right, which you could, you can read them and, use them in dua and in dhikr and these sort of things as well. Okay. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you today. I hope you find it beneficial. Where shall I leave this? Slides. Shall I leave on this? Let's leave on this. Okay. So let's see in the chat. Do you have any questions? Anybody? I don't have anybody backstage right now, but let me know if you have any questions or if you have any thoughts about what I've presented here. I didn't realize I'd been going on for so long, almost 45 minutes. Okay, let me go through these. Walaikum assalam, Geralt of Rivia. I'd really love to go through that story again. Go to read, but I suspect I will never have the time. Okay, so this one, my semen retention journey has helped me a lot in my spiritual journey. I found sex is spiritual, the lust was holy, and that sacred until Shaitan corrupted it, adding wild fantasies. That is definitely true. When Adam waited with Hawa, his children had his spiritual imprint, having uncorrupted spirit of their father, as Adam received it directly from God. So, if a serial killer murders an innocent man, goes home and makes with his wife, he will have a part of his ruh. The child will have a magnetic pull towards ideas which glorify murder, killing, etc. Perhaps explains he only will if he wills, referring to the uncorrupted soul aligned to fitra, that such a man only desires what is made lawful by God, hates everything which is filthy and ugly. As why Jesus said, I seek not my will but the will of my Father, as he is the second human to receive direct divine breath. Okay. God being Father is spiritual sense, not literal. Yes. I've actually thought of that. I mean, anybody who has kids will see that our children definitely do inherit more from us than just genes, right? I'm very, very convinced of that, right? Just when if you have the time, sort of, not the time, but but when you have kids, sometimes you don't get, people don't take as much time of just just watching them and looking at them and thinking why they're like this or like that instead of this other way, right? And there are things which I see. I look at some of my kids from a young age, and I just see like they have something of me which I don't see how it could have come to them just genetically, right? I think we do have this connection, that there's a spiritual inheritance that our kids have as well. Now, I'm not sure in terms of, I don't think that there's a corruption that can be inherited. I don't think that applies, right? So this idea that, where did he put it over here? A murderer. So like here, if a serial killer murders an innocent man and goes to mate with his wife, the seed will have part of that ruh. I'm not sure about that, but I do think that there is, that if you do have which might almost be a contradiction what I'm about to say here, but that if you do have kids in a more like when you're in a more spiritual state, right, and during that time of that period of your life, that's when your children are conceived, right? That there is something more that goes into it. There's something more which goes into that, right? That it does affect your kids in a positive way, right? So does that mean that if you do that in a very negative way, and then your kids are negatively impacted, like a child born of, for example, a rape, right, or a rape and attempted murder, right? And somebody born of that is going to be in a much more, it's going to be affected by that negatively. I don't see how that could be fair, right? So I think that even if you have these kind of like sort of like almost not laws of nature, but things that can be consequences in those sort of way, that there is going to be a protection for the innocent from God from it, right? It's not going to make it so that child born due to that is going to be more inclined to evil because of that. I don't think that's the case. But somebody born from because it's part of how don't forget, it's also part of the person. It's more than just the conception time, right? So there's also the whole period of pregnancy, and you're all there, and you have an outpouring of love for your unborn child, and you have an attention focus to them. You speak to them, right? The mother speaks to the child, the father is speaking to the child, right? Even in the womb, right? Happy when they hear the first kicks, and putting the hand on the mother's belly to feel the child moving. All of these things are there as well, and then they can create a spiritual connection as well, right? And that can be a beneficial thing. Whereas somebody who is a child who isn't in that sort of state, right? A woman who has gone pregnant because of a rape or something, and she's very in a distraught situation, and in the pregnancy she's thinking whether she's abort it or not abort it, or things like this. That kind of stress and that kind of thing, that's the things which will probably affect the child more rather than the actual conception thing. But yeah. It is something which is interesting. How much of our spirituality do our kids inherit, right? And putting that into sort of like historical context and stuff. How much you think of it in terms of, for example, like why we honor, this is just if you actually know the history critically, you will see just how amazing Hassan, Hussein were, and Ali even more so, right? And thinking of who their father was, and mother, Ali and Fatima, that leads you to look at that as well. That there is if you talk about there's going to be a spiritual influence from parents to children, right? Then who had a better positive one of that, after the prophets, than Hassan and Hussein, right, from Ali and Fatima, if you actually understand the history behind, know them critically, so to speak. We have an extra couple of things here from Nico, because the man who Nuh thought was his son was actually from another man. Explained how he behaved. His behavior was different. Well, my meaning, yeah, I mean that's true, but that isn't the explanation of why it was different. He could have not been that. But yes, I do think that Nuh's son was actually from another man, right? But that isn't the reason why he became what he did in the end. We can't blame the choices of kufr, right, and sins on 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 our fathers before we were even born, right? Otherwise, that's all you'd have. You'd only ever have lineages of evil people and lineages of good people, right? And you wouldn't have anything else. Well, my meaning was that he isn't born sinful, but that taint he carries is a child of his dad's spirit. Yeah, I understand. Yes, I do understand, but that exactly what I'm saying I don't think can be true, because it's sort of, it's sort of making it more of an obstacle for an innocent child, right? But also there could be some truth in it, right? And then the full picture behind that could be, again, I've mentioned this before, but I do believe that we choose in many respects before coming to this world. We do choose a lot of things, right? So even the child born from that, I personally believe there is a certain amount of choice that you get to make before coming to this world. As a spirit, you do get to choose, who will be your parents, or which body you want to be born into, sort of, right? So you can have the physical conception of a baby, right? But when does the spirit actually come down into the soul, right? And so I can sort of see that as being part of sort of like the makeup, the temperament, right? Because we do have differences in temperament which are based on our physicality, right? Our brain differences, right? Those who who are more easily to anger, or more easily to this, or these are physical, due to our physical bodies, our physical actual brains. So I could see all of that in terms of we sort of get to choose a little bit of where we come into this world, right? And I mentioned before, that explains to me why, for example, this idea that somebody was born with a disability, and people ask why God caused him to be born in a disability and stuff like, well, we don't have the full story there. We don't have the full picture. It could very well be that the spirit beforehand decided, yes, I am willing to take that challenge of being born as somebody with a disability, right? Wanting to have a higher, sort of like wanting to push more and achieve more in this world by having that obstacle be there. We have here from Amina, Nika, and they ask you about the spirit. Say the spirit is from the command of my Lord. Yeah. Because the Dajjal is Iblis himself walking on earth, human flesh, having knowledge from the millennium, etc. Yeah, I mean, I don't I don't believe in Dajjal, so for me that that's relevant, to be honest. Children become like their parents. I suppose it's due to a large extent materialistically and spiritually. Yeah, there is definitely a pull. There's definitely a pull towards which exists there. So I do believe that. So I mean, no, I'm not denying that there isn't a link. I think there is a link between us and our biological parents, whoever they are, right? Only God knows the spirit, but from the Tartil of Quran, we can understand a little bit. It's like knowledge, programming. Some people, they receive it more than others. Okay. And then also says that's why doctors have doctors and lawyers. Yeah, that's why doctors have doctors, lawyers have lawyers, criminals have criminals. I'm guessing that's more of like a joke, right? Doctors give birth to doctors, huh? But do check my comment on your previous video. It's related to the thought I shared. Okay, yes, I will do. I will do that. All right. Okay. I think we'll end it there. I don't have anybody backstage. Again, if you've never read this book, which I have on the screen now, I do encourage you, if you're interested in this idea of spiritual ascent, using the names, different names of Allah, in terms of for dhikr, have a read of that. I mean, there's a lot more in it than that, but it mentions each of the stages, which name the author who is of a particular Sufi tariqa practice, what they have in their tradition, which ones they use. I mean, it's from the Qadiri Khalwati tariqa, and yeah, and then they have that there. Okay. What do you recommend for depression? For depression, I recommend exactly like pretty much the same as what I've mentioned before in terms of for those who are suicidal and these sort of things. It is to actually work yourself for others, right? See that you can actually be a mercy to other people, right? Like in that verse, لا تقتلوا أنفسكم إن الله كان بكم رحيما. Do not kill yourselves, for truly through you Allah can be merciful, right? The person who is in a state of a suicidal state or is in a depressed state, all of their thoughts are inwards, right? So it's more just about themselves, right, and their own situation. I have this problem, I have this issue. Then mostly it's all sort of like the focus is too much on themselves, right? And they end up seeing too much of the bad things and negative things in their own life. What the best thing for that is to turn that gaze outwards a little, right? And see how, despite your difficult circumstances or the things which are making you depressed, how you are actually able to be a mercy to other people in this world, right? So to go out and actually, be with other people in a way where you are the person who is providing them succor, right? Who is providing them rahmah, right? And you have that idea, arhaman fil ard yarhamuka man fis sama. Show mercy to those in this world, on this earth, and the one in the heavens will show you mercy. So that's what I think. Dhikr is also a big, is definitely something which can help when it comes to depression and stuff. I mean, I find that people who are in a depressed state, they find it very difficult. They find it very difficult to sit there and focus on dhikr. But it's definitely something which, if you can force yourself, all it takes is forcing yourself for just a couple of weeks, right? Just force yourself to get up at night, have some sleep first, get up at night and pray and meditate and do dhikr. You need to force yourself for a while, but slowly it does enlighten the heart, right? And it will pull you out of that state, definitely. Wrong advice. I believe most people are ungrateful. Yeah, well, it's not about them being grateful back to you. right? Again, I don't think that's what it is. I think it's you seeing that you are actually helping people, right? So it's about the perception of yourself, right? That's what I would say. It isn't about, when you say go and do that, it's about the perception of yourself, right? Why you're depressed, right? What is the cause of your depression, right? It's mainly because of the perception of yourself, of your own state in your own life, and these sort of things. Um, so if you turn that around by seeing yourself as a mercy to others, whether they are grateful or ungrateful, right? Um, I think that can help. So yes, people can be bad, right? Um, but keep at it, I would say. What about loving yourself? Well, I mean that's the issue, right? Of a person who's in a state of depression. Um, they wouldn't be in a state of depression if they were loving themselves, right? Um, so, um, what are you going to do to make yourself love yourself more, right? Wouldn't be um, to see yourself to actually not even see yourself, to actually be, and you see it as a factual thing, not just sort of like tricking yourself to love yourself. But when you've seen the actual good that you've done for other people, it will make you appreciate yourself much more, right? And people do. I mean, you're saying people are bad and stuff, but people do. And yet I think you have a very low opinion of a lot of people too much. um, People will be appreciative, right? Maybe in the beginning not, right? But that's part of the idea here, that you have to be patient in this sort of thing, right? You can go out and help somebody, right? And in the beginning, um, you know, when you help somebody, sometimes they're not grateful because they're, they're not seeing it as real, genuine wanting to help them, right? It's sort of like seeing you just want to do a good deed for today, and then they are rude to you or they're bad to you or stuff like that, right? But if you what I'm talking about here is to be genuinely go out and do things to help people, right? And that means helping people means whether they are grateful for it or not, right? It's helping people so then they can be grateful back to you. You're doing it because you're being a mercy. You want to be a mercy to other people, right? It doesn't matter if they're grateful to you back or not, right? And when you are like that with people regularly, you know, they might be ungrateful to you for a month, 2 months, or however long, right? But eventually that they do see the genuineness behind that, and that will melt whatever is in them, making them ungrateful towards you, right? So that's what I would say. Yeah, people are nasty. Yeah, we are living in different times, but really the best advice I have for that. The other advice, like I said, is by dhikr, right? So it's actually force yourself to be regular and disciplined in actual meditation and dhikr of Allah. And that's the other thing which because that's mentioned in the Quran. واذكر ربك لعلك ترضى, right? Then God says to the Prophet, and do a dhikr of your Lord so that you can become, pleased and satisfied, right? And happy. Okay, and also the Quran says, "Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub." By the dhikr of Allah, the hearts find rest, right? Right, that your heart will settle if you if you have remembrance of Allah, right, in your heart, right, your heart will start to settle, and that can take a little bit, but you need to have some discipline behind it, right? And don't do it for like 2 nights, 3 nights, 5 nights, and then say, okay, this isn't working, and stop. I got it in a way. All right. Yeah, again, it's. I know it's a difficult thing, but if you want things to change, you first have to change you, as they say, right? And then that's how it goes. All right. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I understand. It's difficult. Yes, this will be uploaded later. This is just a live stream when I end it. Afterward, it should be live for anybody to review it. I can see that there's quite a few more people watching right now. But we finished our discussion for this evening. I encourage you to listen to it from the beginning. We were discussing the names of Allah and their use in spiritual practices. Um, the idea of spiritual ascension through the divine names, right? All right, okay. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much for attending. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.